The dominion of Vraek had shattered 100 civilizations, turned proud empires into servile colonies, and spread its rule across half the known galaxy. Their war fleets were an unstoppable tide of destruction, and their demands were always met with submission. They expected humanity to do the same. Dane Calloway stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, staring at the incoming transmission from the Vraek High Command. The alien displayed on the screen had 6 cold yellow eyes and a face that looked carved from obsidian. Velrun, Supreme Archon of the Dominion, spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. Humans, you will surrender all military assets and recognize Dominion authority. You will not be harmed. Resist, and your suffering will be absolute. Silence settled over the Terran fleet. Commodore Ralston, standing beside Dane, let out a slow breath. Charming bunch, aren't they? Dane folded his arms. Patch me through. The Vraek stared impassively as Dane leaned toward the holoscreen. Here's our response. Velrun, he reached out and cut the transmission. Ralston grinned. I was hoping you'd do that. The Vraek fleet, a monstrous armada of crescent-shaped warships, had encircled the human stronghold of Cestus Prime. They expected an easy victory. The Dominion always attacked with overwhelming force, assuming sheer size would be enough to make enemies crumble. But humans had never been easy to break. Dane turned to his officers. The Vraek think we'll fight their way. We won't. Ready all ships. The moment they make their move, we hit them where it hurts. The Vraek wasted no time. Their ships surged forward, unleashing a storm of plasma fire that turned the blackness of space into a field of blazing light. The first wave of human ships took evasive action, their smaller frames slipping between the energy blasts. A few were caught in the onslaught, their hulls incinerated instantly. Hold steady, Dane ordered, eyes locked on the tactical display. Let them come in. The Vraek pressed forward, confident in their superiority. That was when the trap closed. Human ships, instead of retreating, accelerated straight toward the enemy. Missiles streaked through the void, hammering against Vraek shields. Smaller vessels wove through the gaps in the Dominion's formation, delivering pinpoint railgun fire to exposed weak points. On the bridge of the Imperium's grasp, Velrun narrowed his eyes. They are reckless. His second-in-command, Vesh, observed the erratic, almost suicidal maneuvers of the human fleet. Or they know something we don't. A Vraek battleship exploded as a squadron of Terran bombers drilled through its shielding, planting warheads directly against its reactor core. A chain reaction of detonations rippled outward, sending debris scattering. Dane watched as his fleet carved into the Dominion's advance. They rely on size, not adaptability. Use that against them. The Dominion had never fought an enemy that refused to break ranks. They had always counted on fear, but the humans did not fear them. Velrun's lips curled. Crush them. More Dominion ships surged forward, plasma lances cutting into human vessels, tearing apart hulls. The Terrans took losses, but for every ship they lost, they took 2 Vraek warships with them. Dane's fingers tightened on the armrest of his command chair. Prepare the next phase. The battle raged for hours, turning the space above Cestus Prime into a graveyard of shattered vessels. But humans had a different definition of endurance. They didn't fight for honor or glory or even survival. They fought to win. And winning meant being unpredictable. As the Vraek pushed deeper into the battlefield, hidden ground-based rail cannons on Cestus Prime powered up. The Dominion had assumed planetary defenses were non-existent. Their arrogance cost them. The first railgun round punched through the belly of a Dominion dreadnought, splitting it apart in a fiery explosion. The second found its mark in the heart of another battleship. Velrun recoiled as more of his ships fell. This was not how the war was supposed to go. Vesh's voice was tight with disbelief. Archon. Their defenses are stronger than expected. Velrun's jaw tightened. Fall back. Across the Dominion fleet, ships began pulling away, their attack in shambles. The human fleet did not pursue. They didn't need to. The message had been sent. Dane exhaled, watching the Vraek retreat. He knew this wasn't over. They had won a battle, but the war had just begun. Ralston chuckled. That'll bruise their pride. Dane nodded. And make them dangerous. The Vraek had expected submission. Instead, they had found an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. A war they would never forget had only just begun. The Vraek Dominion did not tolerate failure. Velryn stood in the war chamber of the Dominion flagship Imperium's Wrath, surrounded by the towering holograms of his fellow Archons. Their golden ceremonial armor gleamed in the projection, their expressions carved from stone. You assured us this species would surrender, one of them said, voice cold. Velryn clenched his jaw. Their resistance was unexpected. Another Archon leaned forward. Do you mean to tell us the mighty Dominion was bested by creatures so fragile they require suits to survive half the worlds we breathe freely? Velryn's hands curled into fists. They are more dangerous than we calculated. They do not fight with logic. They do not break under superior force. They adapt. The Supreme War Archon, an elder Vraek named Siren, spoke at last. Then we will show them the true weight of Dominion wrath. You will not return to the throne world in disgrace, Velryn. You will return when humanity has been reduced to ash. The holograms vanished and Velryn turned to Vesh. Prepare the invasion fleet. We take Cestus Prime, or we take their heads. Dane Calloway paced the war room aboard the Indomitable, watching the tactical feeds streaming in. The Vraek weren't retreating. They were regrouping. Commodore Ralston tapped a display. They're pulling reinforcements from deep space. They're not making the same mistake twice. Dane exhaled. We knew this was coming. We bloodied their nose, but that just made them angry. General Soren Vasquez, commanding officer of the Cestus Prime Ground Forces, folded his arms. They're not going to play around this time. They'll level the planet from orbit before sending troops. Ralston let out a sharp breath. They're used to overwhelming force. They don't do prolonged engagements. If we force them into one, we might have a chance. Dane nodded. We need to stretch them out, make them fight on our terms. Soren raised a brow. You want to drag this out. Dane's eyes darkened. I want to make them regret setting foot in this system. The second Vraek attack came with fury. Their dreadnoughts led the charge, unleashing plasma bombardments that turned the outer edges of Cestus Prime's defenses into molten wreckage. But the humans didn't scatter. Dane's fleet met them in a brutal counterstrike, launching coordinated waves of fighters and missile barrages that targeted the joints of Vraek warships, finding gaps in their defenses. The Dominion had adjusted their tactics. Their ships now adapted faster, covering each other's weak points, deploying energy barriers that disrupted incoming fire. But humans had adjusted too. As the battle raged, smaller Terran strike teams infiltrated enemy warships through the wreckage of earlier skirmishes. They cut their way into Vraek vessels, planting explosives and sabotaging systems from within. Velryn watched his ship suffer internal detonations, entire decks venting into the void. He slammed a fist into his command panel. How are they boarding us? Vesh looked over the reports. They're using debris fields as cover. Their tactics are unpredictable. Velryn's mandibles clicked in frustration. Then burn everything. The Vraek dreadnoughts unleashed waves of gravitational pulses, tearing through the battlefield, disintegrating debris and hidden infiltrators. Dane gritted his teeth as the human fleet took heavy losses. They needed another edge. He turned to his officers. Deploy the swarm. Across the battlefield, hundreds of autonomous drone fighters, small, agile, nearly invisible to scanners, activated. They zipped between the Dominion warships, targeting weapon systems, disabling engines, and wreaking havoc. The Vraek had seen drones before, but not like these. The AI-controlled swarms coordinated without hesitation, diving into gaps in their defenses faster than organic pilots ever could. Velryn's eyes narrowed. They fight like machines, but with the instincts of beasts. The battle was no longer one of pure firepower. It was a war of strategy, of counter-strategy, of relentless adaptation. And the Vraek were losing. The first Dominion landing forces touched down on Cestus Prime hours later. The planet was already scarred from orbital bombardments, but its underground cities remained intact. The Vraek expected quick conquest. They had never fought a ground war against humans before. They soon learned their mistake. Soren Vasquez led the first counterattack, striking the Vraek landing zones before they could establish proper defenses. Human strike teams, operating in near darkness beneath the ruined skylines, ambushed the towering, armored Vraek soldiers with ruthless precision. The Vraek were physically stronger, their exoskeletal armor capable of withstanding direct fire. But they were used to fighting enemies who fled before engaging in close combat. Humans did not flee. They fought with scavenged weapons, with makeshift explosives, with knives if they had to. A Vraek officer found himself locked in hand-to-hand combat with a Terran Marine. He struck with bone-shattering force, expecting the human to break. Instead, the Marine grinned through bloody teeth, grabbed a combat knife, and buried it into the joint of the Vraek's carapace. The Dominion had never encountered an enemy that smiled while bleeding. For every street the Vraek took, they lost 2. Their numerical advantage was meaningless when every ruined building was a death trap, when every civilian was another set of eyes feeding intelligence to the human resistance. Velrin watched the reports, his frustration boiling into fury. How are they still standing? Vesh hesitated before responding. They don't stop, Archon. They don't know how to stop. Velrin's eyes darkened. Then we will force them. Dane Calloway sat in the war bunker beneath Cestus Prime's capital, studying the latest battle reports. The Vraek weren't breaking, but neither were they winning. Ralston leaned against the wall. We keep this up, they'll have no choice but to withdraw. Dane wasn't convinced. They won't accept defeat. They'll escalate. Soren grimaced. Escalate how? Dane looked at the star charts. If they can't break us here, they'll go after the rest of our colonies. They'll try to make an example of someone else. Silence settled over the room. Ralston sighed. Then we don't just hold the line. We hit them first. Dane nodded. We take the fight to them. The war was no longer about defense. It was about survival. And survival meant making the Dominion realize that humanity was not just another species to be conquered. They had expected surrender. Instead, they had started a war they would never forget. Velrin stood at the viewport of Imperium's wrath, watching the battlefield unfold below. The war was dragging on longer than any in Dominion history. Humanity was not crumbling, it was evolving. Vesh approached carefully, aware of the growing tension in his commander's posture. The Terrans are preparing a counteroffensive. We intercepted transmissions suggesting a fleet is mobilizing beyond Cestus Prime. Velrin's 6 yellow eyes narrowed. They refused to accept the inevitable. Vesh hesitated. Perhaps they are inevitable. Velrin turned, eyes gleaming with fury. Do not speak of them as equals. We will break them, he exhaled slowly, then straightened. Prepare the purge fleet. If they will not surrender, then we will make their worlds uninhabitable. Vesh's mandibles twitched. Even for the Dominion, extermination was extreme. But he did not question. Orders were orders. The Vraek had underestimated humans once. They would not make the same mistake again. Dane Calloway stood in the command center of the Indomitable, watching the tactical display. The Dominion fleet had stalled, but they weren't retreating. They were waiting for something. Ralston studied the data. They're gathering reinforcements. A lot of them. Dane nodded. They've realized we're not going to break, so they're changing tactics. Soren's voice crackled over the comm. How bad is it? Dane's jaw tightened. Bad enough that we can't sit back anymore. If we let them regroup, they'll wipe out every colony we have. Ralston exhaled. So we hit them first. Dane looked at the star map. We know where their staging grounds are. We strike before they can launch their final assault. The plan was madness. The Dominion outnumbered them in every way, but humans had never won wars by playing fair. They won by being unpredictable. The attack on the Vraek staging ground at Tarvis Rift began with complete silence. The Dominion's fleet, massing for their final strike, detected nothing as it hung in orbit over the lifeless moon. Their sensors, calibrated for large-scale engagements, failed to notice the human ships gliding in under the cover of radiation bursts from a nearby pulsar. Then the first explosions erupted. Human bombers, equipped with new stealth plating, emerged from the void and delivered precise strikes to the Vraek supply lines. Ammunition depots ignited, sending shockwaves through the fleet. Ships that had been at rest were suddenly ablaze. Before the Dominion could respond, the main human fleet arrived. They didn't attack head-on. Instead, they split into smaller strike groups, hitting from multiple angles, overwhelming the Vraek with sheer chaos. Velryn, aboard Imperium's Wrath, watched in stunned silence. "They are not fighting a battle," Vesh murmured. "They are hunting." Velryn's mandibles clenched. "Then we will remind them that they are prey." The Dominion fleet responded with calculated precision, forming defensive formations, countering the human hit-and-run tactics with overlapping fields of fire. Their experience in countless wars made them formidable even in unexpected situations. But humans had an advantage the Dominion did not. They had learned how the Vraek thought. Dane's voice was calm over the comms. Phase 2, now. A second human fleet, hidden in the asteroid belt beyond the rift, suddenly roared to life. Dozens of battleships surged forward, catching the Dominion in a pincer movement. Velryn realized too late that he had been outmaneuvered. His forces were now fighting on two fronts, their supply lines cut, their coordination unraveling. For the first time in Dominion history, a major fleet was being routed. Vesh turned to Velryn. "Archon, we must retreat." Velryn stared at the chaos on the battlefield. It wasn't just a loss. It was an unraveling of Dominion dominance. The Vraek had expected a quick war. Instead, they had waged one they could no longer control. His jaw tightened. "Fall back." Across the battlefield, Dominion ships disengaged, fleeing into the darkness of space. Dane watched them go, his face unreadable. He knew what this meant. The Dominion wasn't finished. They would return with everything they had. And humanity would be ready. Velryn stood before the High Council of the Dominion. The chamber, built from obsidian and silver, stretched high above him, lined with towering statues of past conquerors. The 6 Archons, their golden eyes reflecting the flickering light, loomed over him like executioners. "You have failed Supreme War Archon," Surin said. His voice was cold, final. Velryn did not flinch. "The humans are unlike any enemy we have faced. Their unpredictability makes them impossible to control through conventional means." "Then we will not use conventional means," another Archon replied. Surin leaned forward. "The humans must be erased, their systems burned, their memory wiped from history. We will remind the galaxy that defiance has only one outcome." Velryn straightened. "Then give me command of the Annihilation Fleet." Surin studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Burn them from the stars." Dane Calloway stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, staring at the incoming data. The Dominion fleet was on the move again, and this time they weren't holding back. Ralston whistled low. "That's every warship they've got within 100 light years." Soren's voice crackled over the comms. "We can't fight that head-on." Dane nodded. "We won't." Ralston raised an eyebrow. "You have something in mind." Dane tapped the display, highlighting a system on the far edge of human-controlled space. "We make our stand here." Soren frowned. "There's nothing there but a dying star and some scattered moons." Dane's lips curled into a grim smile. "Exactly." The Dominion fleet arrived in the Veil Nebula expecting a desperate human defense. Instead, they found empty space. Velryn's mandibles twitched. "Where are they?" Vesh studied the scanners. "They must be hiding in the debris fields." Velryn's patience had run out. "Burn them out." Dominion warships spread out, plasma cannons firing into the nebula, turning floating rock and ice into molten slag, but the humans remained unseen. Then the first Dominion ship exploded. A hidden human strike force, buried within the wreckage of old battlefields, had been waiting. As the Dominion spread themselves thin, the attack began. Human ships burst from the dust clouds, targeting engines and command decks, crippling Dominion formations before vanishing again into the swirling chaos of the nebula. Velryn snarled. Reform the fleet. They cannot hide forever. But that was the problem. They weren't hiding. They were hunting. Dane's voice came over the open channel. You thought we'd make this easy. Velryn's eyes widened as he saw an entire asteroid field, moving. The humans had turned the debris into weapons, using tug ships and explosives to send massive rock formations into the Dominion fleet at terrifying speeds. Ships were crushed, torn apart, caught in collisions they couldn't escape. The once mighty Dominion armada was disintegrating. Velryn refused to accept it. Full retreat. But it was too late. The last thing Velryn saw before his flagship was torn apart was the Terran fleet emerging from the storm, relentless, unstoppable. Dane stood in the war room, watching the final transmissions of the battle. The Dominion fleet was gone. Ralston let out a slow breath. We did it. Soren's voice was grim. They'll never forget this. Dane nodded. Good, because neither will we. Humanity had been expected to surrender. Instead, they had fought a war the Dominion would never forget.